Hi there, welcome to the Bad Vibes Club. This is the first of a series of 10 podcasts all about sculpture, and it features me and my friend Andrea Franchi talking about 10 different texts that we've read together about sculpture. You can read along with us, and you can do that by going to dekersaint.com, which is dekersaint.com/Bad Vibes Club, and there you will find links to zip files containing the text that we're talking about in each episode, along with kind of supplementary or additional readings, things that we've read alongside that text. These podcasts are made for pleasure. Me and Andrea were interested in doing them, but they're also really made for our teaching practices. We're both interested in offering students different ways into art historical thinking or different art historical approaches, and these texts, all of them offer slightly kind of off-kilter takes on art history. Some of the texts are written by theorists, some of the texts are written by curators, some of them are written by artists, some of them are really dense and hard work, and some of them are really fun and easy to read. The aim here is to try and kind of get into a lot of different ways of thinking about sculpture in order that students can find a way into the subject. That's also why we're producing these podcasts, in the sense that we're offering up this, conversation which is very informal, but, it might be a way into reading the text. All right, I'll leave that for now, and I'll let myself and Andrea introduce the text that we're going to read, which is Helen Molesworth writing in the Part Object, Part Sculpture catalogue, and it's a text called Duchamp by Hand Even.
This text is by Helen Molesworth and is on the catalogue of Part Object, Part Sculpture, which is an exhibition that she curated in 2005. And the name of her essay that is Duchamp by Hand Even. I thought about it because I had quite a few students this year that are interested in handmade and touch, especially the quality, a sculpture that can be touched and can be held and has specific weights. And I didn't have any, I felt really lost in terms of reference of how to what they should read. And I found this text which is looking at these 3 sculptures that Duchamp made, who have this kind of characteristic of being portable, and they can be handheld, but they're also made by hand. And I think we were just both really excited on what does that bring into thinking of sculpture.
So we should say that the format of these podcasts is essentially we're going to go through the text, right? That's the idea, that we'd go through the text and offer commentary and ask questions and give quotes and stuff. So if you're interested in reading the text, I might put a PDF up so people can download it. You could read along with us, or you could read it and then listen to the podcast, or you could listen to the podcast and read, or you could just simply note that we have read it and decide we're idiots and go off and just read it on your own. Any of those are good ways of reading the text. The thing I was going to say was that I was really excited about it because it talks about Étant, donnés. Is that how you pronounce that?
I'm the wrong person to ask that.
So Duchamp's Étant, donnés, which we'll talk about, which is a late work by Duchamp, one that was made kind of in secret.
Yeah, very much in secret. So there's another text that maybe you can also put the PDF. It's an art forum essay that Molesworth wrote specifically on the donnés, and she has this amazing thing when she says that he built it for 20 years in his flat, and he had made a fake wall so people would visit him and would not know that he was working on this, which is amazing. But
the point being with Duchamp, so to step back a little bit, part of the interest in all the texts that we're going to choose is that they offer a way into art history. And I've been finding with teaching is that's what I really want to help my students find ways into art history that are not straightforward readings of art history that don't, I don't know, what's the phrase, quite standard ways of thinking about art history. And one of the ways of thinking about Duchamp in those terms is that he invented the ready-made and invented conceptual art, and then that's what happened, and that was the 20th century. And Étant donné is the other bit of Duchamp that people weren't talking about as much. They have been over the last 20 years, I suppose. Molesworth refers to that in this essay. And Étant donné was this secret project that was almost, could be understood as a very different way of working from the ready-mades. And I think I'd heard someone say that there were two kinds of, postmodern art. One which came from the readymades and one which comes from Étant, donnés. And I think that's really interesting. But what Molesworth does in this text is bring together the kind of early and late Duchamp through the notion of handmade and touch. And it's a really well written essay. That's what I was rereading it today. And she's just a very good writer. So it's a real pleasure to read. So I do recommend that everyone read it. So how do you want to start, Andrea? Should we just start going through? Have you got quotes you want to go through?
So I have a problem, which is I read the text 3 times and I made 3 times notes in very different things. Okay. And it's almost like it's such a rich text that every time I read the text, it was sort of a bit of a different text because I pay attention to different things.
So it's about Marcel Duchamp. That's the first thing to say. It's about Marcel Duchamp, and it opens with a description of what are generally known as his 3 erotic objects, which are female fig leaf, objet d'art, and wedge of chastity, all made in the 50s. And they're quite enigmatic objects in multiple ways. And she uses those to kind of go into other parts of his practice, like talking about the readymades, talking about Étant, donnés. What should we say about her writing on the erotic objects, maybe?
So that's something that is interesting, right? Because I think we were looking at each other's notes, and I think you are a lot more interested in the erotic side of her framework and how she's using Melanie Klein and things like that. Well, I think I'm quite interested in the distribution of these objects. This idea, like what happens. I'm interested in what happens when you make a sculpture is supposed to be touch, and at some point she's doing 2 things at the same time. So I think at the beginning, like my first quote was when it was in one of the first paragraphs, she's like talking about the 3 erotic objects, but then she's talking about how they're not fixed in space, that they have this domestic scale, that there are objects that, live in like kitchen tables and mantelpieces, that they don't live in like the plinth, but they also don't live in the floor, like minimalism. Okay, so
that's the quote, that's my first quote. They establish a tabletop scale for sculpture, refusing both monumentality and the need for a base. And I think that's super interesting in terms of my kind of understanding of 20th century Western sculpture, in which, well, maybe not 20th century, modern Western sculpture, in which, first things come down off the plinth and then they start spreading out across the floor, essentially. So you have like Rodin's, is it Gates of Hell? Which is like, the claim is that's the first like modern sculpture because it stands on its own and it doesn't sit on top of a plinth. And then you have minimalism in the 60s onwards, refusing verticality, like spreading across the floor, operating on the horizontal. And then there's actually an interesting reading parallel to that, which is about formlessness, but we won't get into that now. But that's Rosalind Krauss and Yves Alain Bois' like take on modernism. This refuses all of those, well, not refuses, but is slightly different, slightly parallel to all of those things, and I think that is lovely. The notion of the domestic scale, something that sits on a tabletop.
Yeah, and that they carry, I don't know, one of the objects is like this object that they use, so he and his wife at the time uses like as a wedding ring, so this sculpture that kind of comes apart and goes together. And there's chastity. Is this sense that they just carry it in their pockets or something, this sculpture that you carry in your pockets. And there's something about how that, I think I call it like distribution, but it's also, it's an object that he's making these objects while he's making Étant, donnés, and he's handing them to friends or like multiples, but they're kind of like, they're circulating a completely different structure than the structure of his other works. And I think there is something, and this is what I thought it was exciting for my students, which is the students that are working on these things. It might be like a post-COVID thing, but the students that are working on the things that are like domestic and to behold, how do you show that in an exhibition art school? You can't. They cannot exist in that space, so they're kind of lost. And to me, just thinking about that is that, of course, because these objects are made to circulate in this other way. They create these intimate relations. They are like objects that you carry close to yourself, that you position. So you have to have like a different art economy and art context.
That's super interesting because the 3 erotic objects are additions. So there's multiple, they're made in multiple, and they're given to friends or they're given to gallerists to sell for multiple reasons that Helen Molesworth goes into.
But even the selling is interesting, right? Because there's one of them that he makes 10 and then they give it to Man Ray because Man Ray needed money. So it's not even for Duchamp to sell. He's making this object as a gift to a friend that then goes and sells them for money.
But the wedge of chastity is the interesting one out of the 3 because it's a 2-part sculpture that it's hard to describe, but it's essentially one half of it is it a kind of alginate that is used by dentists to make dental impressions, and the other part is what they keep calling galvanized plaster. But I've never heard of galvanized plaster, but I assume it's some kind.
Oh, I googled it. It's plaster that has like a metal structure inside to keep.
Oh, it has metal inside. Okay.
I was also very puzzled.
Yeah, well done. Anyway, but it's kind of when you open the two parts, inside the alginate part is what Helen Molesworth describes as a shockingly pink pussy or something like that. So it is very explicit and also quite a weird abstract object. But until part object, part sculpture, which was the exhibition that this text kind of sits alongside, actually in exhibition it had never been shown taken apart.
Isn't it amazing?
It's crazy because like I remember seeing these sculptures and being completely confused, being like, okay, I understand the Duchamp readymades. Oh, and I kind of understand Étant. Well, not understand, that's the wrong word. You know, I was 19, I didn't understand anything. But like, oh yeah, Étant donnés, that's kind of mad and cool. But like, what are these weird, like muddy, weird phallic objects, or like not just phallic, like, but these objects? And one of them, yeah, like it's completely impossible to read without maybe not being touched, but without being demonstrated. And demonstration is very, very hard. It's another, a thing that I agree with in terms of students who are interested in participation or activating the audience. And that is hard for like any exhibition practice. I don't think that's just within universities. I think that's really, really hard. And that's why you get kind of spectacular interactivity, I don't know, of Cast and Holler or something with the slides or something that is both like extremely simple and involves quite a lot of direction and high production. And these things, yeah, they're made as editions, so they're sold through galleries, and basically people keep them in their houses. And I guess when someone comes around, they're like, oh, I got this new, Marcel made a new sculpture, look at this. And then they demonstrate it, or they hold it up, or they just play with it, right?
Yeah, you just keep them on the table in the office, and whenever they're thinking, they're just like playing with this, like.
So how does she get from those to the ready-made? It's through the fact that they're handmade, right?
Yeah, so I think her point is that this is what allows Duchamp to make the reproductions of the ready-mades.
Oh, let's step back a bit. What happened to the original ready-mades?
So the ready-mades are amazing, right? Because what she's saying is like they are this. I mean, she's not calling them, but I'm gonna call them. They're almost like non-objects. So it's like the ready-made is a commodity. You go, you see this thing, you buy it, you bring it into the gallery. People don't even have to look at them because they know where they are. You know, you just glimpse and they're like, oh, it's a urinal in a gallery space.
It was part of his interest in non-retinal art, right?
Yes.
Or anti-retinal.
I think it's anti-retinal. Yeah. And then...
So the famous examples are like Fountain, which is an upturned urinal. These are the really classic ones in terms of they are really found objects that are represented. Bottle Rack, which is a bottle rack presented in a gallery. In Advance of the Broken Arm, which is a spade that's hung on the wall. There's lots of other ones mentioned. Ones I didn't know about, actually. Fresh Widow. Do you see that?
No. I saw there's one that there's not even photos of. Like there's one that...
Oh, Traveller's Folding Item. The original one wasn't even photographed. But the replica is in his Boîte de Valises, and, you know, replicas were made, multiple replicas were made. But anyway, what happens to all of the original ones is that exactly because of this thing, because they come out, they stop being commodities, right? So he buys a urinal and installs it sideways. But then, of course, he doesn't ever then like reinstall it somewhere as a urinal. But it also doesn't really become art. It doesn't get reshown in the 1910s, 1920s when he's making these ready-mades. And so it just gets lost, or he moves studio and doesn't take it with him, or... Yeah,
so I would disagree. I would say they remain as commodities forever. That's what makes it cool.
No, because then they don't retain they don't get exchanged for anything. They just get like discarded. Or...
You don't know, someone, like a janitor just found a urinal and we're like, oh, I'm going to just sell it.
That's it. Yeah. Someone's like, oh, this bottle rack. Finally, someone to dry my bottles. Yeah, all right, okay. I can't remember what her line is, but essentially... In the late 50s, I think, there's a flourish of interest in Duchamp's ready-mades. And that does this canonical idea of Duchamp being the guy who invented conceptual art by making the ready-mades. That's when we get... Hal Foster's claim is that Duchamp only becomes Duchampian in the 1950s and 1960s. I think that's a really important thing to say, is that when we are talking about Marcel Duchamp, really we're talking about the version of Marcel Duchamp that gets constituted through a series of retrospectives and, you know,
And through the US.
And
through
in the
US
US,
art
exactly.
critic, which is super important because we're talking about Krauss and we're talking about Foster.
Yeah.
And then Molesworth study with Krauss and Foster, like were kind of like placed in a very specific, like national context.
And so part of this is that, I mean, it's quite a complex history that she does a really good job of outlining, but some gallerists just start reproducing new versions of the ready-mades.
Yeah, so there's like a Swedish reproduction for a museum that is done in the 60s, and then Duchamp only finds out in 61.
Yeah, like
and then
when
he goes and signed them.
Yeah.
Which is beautiful.
Well, Duchamp, you know, he was game.
He was always game.
Yeah. And then the one I got quite interested because I studied in Newcastle, and I knew this history about Richard Hamilton, the British kind of pop artist, remakes the large glass, which is not a ready-made, sorry, but it was made around that time. Makes a new version of the large glass with a load of students, and that's got a super interesting history as well. Anyway, that's a bit of a side route. Because then so these unofficial versions of the ready-mades are made, and then what happens? He decides to work with a gallerist to make some new ones.
Yes, one Italian, but I'm just gonna go back a little earlier in the kind of like the history of the thing, because also there's a Swedish reproduction in the 60s or like in 1960 that Duchamp signed 61, but also like Rauschenberg finds the same bottle rack that Duchamp used and buys it. So like the similar brand, in like the 60, and Duchamp doesn't like that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So
great.
there's this object that is not really recognized that is sort of a Duchamp ready. I think he ends up signing it, but it's like a Duchamp ready-made, but it's the only one that is not a replica. It's one that is reproduced in the same way that the ready-mades were made. But at that point, Duchamp is not happy with it because it's an old object. It's like a vintage thing. It's not like a real circulating object anymore.
That's interesting because I was Googling around trying to find trebuchet, which is a coat rack that you would normally hang on the wall, placed on the floor. And I can't remember if trebuchet means something like fall over or something. It's basically a kind of trip hazard. And yeah, there's a blog someone wrote about finding the same object in a charity shop, like, you know, in the 90s or something. And that's interesting. So he didn't like that. He didn't like the idea that they would be vintage objects because it's not the way that it's not the process that he followed, which was buying contemporary, industrially produced objects. Yeah, that's great. So then he works with a variety of galleries to produce, or is it one gallery?
So it's like a series, like an Italian.
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
Reproduction in 64. Then he does all the 10 of them. I think 10 different ready-mades.
Yeah.
And different like.
And they're made from photos. So they're made from photos and detailed plans of the original ready-mades, and they're made all by craftsmen. So they're handmade. This is the point of the essay.
Except the urinal, which is amazing, which is like the closest factory that makes like, how do you call it? It's like
plumbing or whatever. Yeah.
And then, so it's like, I don't even know what the method of production of that is, because it's an industrial production at a craft level.
I guess they just have to, replace all the molds with these new molds but
to
even
make this limited object.
Yeah.
So it still feels like, I don't know.
I mean, what it does, what Helen Molesworth calls it a wrinkle in the history of the ready-mades, because the neat version of that history is Duchamp invents the ready-mades when he invents them in the 1910s, and that changes art history. But what actually happens is that Duchamp does invent that process of creating the ready-mades and does display found objects as art, as it were. But the ones that we've all seen in person, perhaps in the Tate or in other museums around the world, are not found objects. They are made objects, but they are often used to make the claim that the contribution that Duchamp's ready-mades give to art is like the way that you could just pick something up off the street and put it in a gallery. And, you know, they lead to Robert Rauschenberg. No. There's a line that I often give to I can't remember if it's Robert Rauschenberg or Jasper Johns, but his line, find something, do something to it, do something else. So it's like all of these...
I think that's Rauschenberg.
Is that Rauschenberg? Okay, so these lines that come from 60s artists, which are about, you know, going out into the world and like grabbing something and like working quickly, but that being linked to a kind of form of conceptual practice, being about ideas. And, you know, Richard Hamilton, his reading of Duchamp was very much about conceptual art and enacting ideas in material form and stuff. But the way that the examples that illustrate all these ideas are these handmade things that are like reproductions of objects that you couldn't buy in the shops anymore, because Duchamp wanted the original ready-mades to reappear in galleries and stuff. It's just so great. And Molesworth's claim is that these 3 erotic objects give Duchamp permission to kind of re-engage in a public way with his interest in making things by hand or crafted things. Okay.
And I think it's important to say that the part sculpture, part object, or part object, part sculpture exhibition is actually like a sort of like new genealogy for like contemporary sculpture. So that's what Molesworth is proposing. She's proposing, okay, if we kind of like read this Duchamp instead of the other Duchamp, then what is the actual canon that kind of like builds contemporary Western sculpture, which is like Eva Hesse and Kusama, Louis Bourgeois, Jasper Jones, Robert Gober, like all these different. I think there's a lot of critiques of the exhibition saying like, well, actually, maybe not, but I think. I
mean, that's a great critique. I'm going to use that.
but it's interesting in the sense of like how this canonical histories become so strong. It's like that's what I learned at university, right? Is that you have like these are like the big narratives of sculpture, minimalism, conceptualism, and I think Molesworth has a history of doing that. She has like an amazing essay on like feminist conceptualist artists and kind of like proposing once you find that the wrinkle in this kind of original stories, then that wrinkle kind of like can suddenly give origin to a completely new reading of like the sequences that come after it.
Well, I think I've just found a note that I wrote, which is it's really important to state that the original ready-mades and the erotic objects have 40-ish years between them, and then 10 years later or something, Étant, donnés is revealed to the public and donated. So that's 40 years of a career where he was still doing stuff. It wasn't like there was this claim that Duchamp stopped making art in 1923 or something and just played chess, but that just wasn't really true.
He made that claim. That's what's fantastic.
Yeah, totally, yeah. But people love that claim. I loved that when I was at university. I thought it was like, that was the final avant-garde gesture to like give up art and do something else.
And instead he was making this like massive sculpture with like fake water and light.
Yeah, like a diorama, like this horrible, like cheesy, cringy thing that would have been anathema to the standard reading of, or whatever, Duchamp. But because of that wrinkle, it connects these, what could be understood as completely separate bits of his career. But actually they're not separate. Continue. Because of course with Duchamp as well, the other really famous work, or the canonical work at least, is Nude Descending a Staircase. And that it's kind of hard to find ways of talking about all the different bits of Duchamp's practice. Because like he was interested in a kind of, I don't know if there was a name for it, but like a kind of time-based cubism, right? Like this capturing of movement and stuff like that. But it's all, they are all connected themes and they do kind of move across. So Helen Molesworth does a great read in connecting the ready-mades and the large glass through looking at the Boîte de Valise, which is the little miniature version of his oeuvre that Duchamp made in the, I don't know when he made that. Is that in the 20s?
No, I think that's closer
35, 41. Boîte en Valise, sorry. Anyway, but I think that's really important to, if we're thinking about art students who are maybe, either on their BA kind of in their early 20s or doing an MA a little bit older, people who've been making work for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, even 10 years. But like these objects that are being kind of connected here are 40 years apart. And, I think that's just super interesting on its own as a fact. But it also connects, two entirely separate art histories, which is the kind of original, art world in which Duchamp did those ready-mades and the art world that has kind of been reconstituted by the grand art histories of the 20th century.
I think it's also really interesting. Like I found Duchamp fascinating because he's like, in one sense, I think he's just brilliant. And on the other hand, he's like this teenage boy in the art world, right? He's like fascinated with like porny things and double entendres and like chaos. I remember when I was at uni, like my favorite work by Duchamp was when he I think it's before the readymades, he organizes exhibition and convinces all his friends to exhibit. And then he says he's going to exhibit on the ceiling. And then he covers the ceiling with these fabrics full of coal that are threatening people that are going to fall. And then all his friends are really annoyed because they're like, we put all this effort to make this exhibition. You basically just use us to make this massive joke. And I think there's this kind of like weird entitled humor that I will find profoundly annoying in artists now. And I just find it so charming in Duchamp somehow.
I definitely agree. And that's exactly how I wanted to read Duchamp when I was at university. I'm still, I still have a adolescent streak when it comes to making art. But I do think that these readings are not quite right. There's the other one of that is in the first Surrealism exhibition in... I can't remember if this is Paris or if this is New York. He gets a load of string and puts string in front of all the other works. And the only pictures that survive of this make it look like you can't get to the other works. So yeah, it's this like big joke that Duchamp makes it impossible to look at the exhibition. But actually, I can't remember where I read this. This is another like one of this sort of essays, kind of going back into the archives and looking. If you read comments on the exhibition, none of them mentions this at all, and actually it's not a problem at all. Like they just took a picture to make it look like that, because that obviously was the best angle of the work. But actually it's like lots of the artists really enjoyed it, and it like guided people around the exhibition. So yeah, definitely he did these big jokes and these silly things. But also like there's this dominant reading of Duchamp as this like silly boy who did things to like annoy people or troll, right? Like that's what you might describe it as at the moment. But when you look at the works, give them time, they're not trolling. And Molesworth is really good on Étant, donnés, right? Which had a bit of a troubled history because by the time it was being, I think photographs were allowed to circulate, lots of people did quite like reductive critiques of it, saying that it was essential. I'm not going to describe it because it's just too hard. Just Google it. But yeah, it involves like a naked woman who you can't see a torso, that you can't see the head of. It's got lots of sex stuff, erotic. It's very erotic, but it's also might refer to some kind of violence or the confusion of those two things. So she's just
naked with her legs spread open, and then you could...
And yeah, you can't see her face. But Molesworth gives it enough time and she reveals this really interesting history in that other article you said about... Is it Art Review or Art Monthly or something? Art Forum, sorry. Yeah. And yeah, like talks about the way it was made, and it's modelled on 3 different women, is that right?
Yes, 3 different women.
And it's like, it could, like you can read it as a kind of horrible misogynistic joke, but if you give it any kind of time at all, like Wedge of Chastity, it's like, it's like a vagina, well, it's not a vagina, it's a pussy, but he gave it to his wife, and they shared it like a like a wedding ring for their whole married life. So it can't be reduced to this like.
Well, but I think it cannot be reduced to the joke, but it's still a joke, right? Like Étant donnés still like has this kind of like really kitsch wooden door, and you have to like lower yourself down to be able to look at it through a peephole while everybody else is queuing behind you. It's still like doing all this.
Yeah, it's got this antagonistic relationship to the viewer, which lots of boy artists, myself included, loved when they first heard about it, for sure. But that doesn't go away. But I think, returning to them has been really nice because, for example, in that piece about Étant donnés, Molesworth's claim is that actually when you see the work in person, the voyeuristic relationship for the most part feels like it's not between you and the woman, but between all the people queuing behind you and you. So you're being looked at, looking. And that's the key like feeling like that is evoked or whatever by the piece, is not the feeling of being a peeping Tom, but the feeling of being watched by other people and not
while
knowing.
You're in a peeping Tom.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
while you're the peeping Tom.
Yeah, because isn't that like... Anyway, there's some kind of Lacanian thing about the big other there. Or anyway. Oh no, it's that's Sartre, isn't it? He's talking about like looking through a keyhole at someone undressing and then realising that you're being watched by someone else. Anyway. So is it kind of like, like a more complex side to those jokes.
Definitely. But I think just remain a little bit more with the Étant donnés, what I think it does that is super interesting, and Molesworth goes into it, but I think not as much as I would like her to. But she talks a lot about how what Duchamp sculpture does is like it's interested in your like body relationship to the sculpture. So in the case of ready-made is because this sculpture that is an object that used to using, but then suddenly you don't know how to behave in front of it because you don't know how to use it. And then in the Étant donnés, it's still like, forcing you to even position yourself in a certain way, and then kind of like, be seen by everybody, positioning your body in a certain way. And then what I like about the 3 erotic sculptures is that then you have this narrative of like the body relation to sculpture, and that these sculptures are meant to be touched and hold, and that is something also that is not nothing. It's kind of amazing, again, to have this thing that demands to be held and carried and move.
And it's almost like Molesworth does a nice thing in the construction of this essay where I'm going to ruin it for you right now, but the 3 erotic objects, 2 of them, female fig leaf and objet d'art, are almost like remnants from the making of Étant donné. So female fig leaf is how he cast, it's a cast from the mould that he also used to cast the pudenda of the woman in Étant donné. And objet d'art is a cast of the remnant that was broken off that would have supported the breast. So it's this quite phallic object that would have supported the breast of the figure in Étant donné. Wedge of Chastity seems to be related to those things, but I don't think Molesworth can find any particular relationship to Étant donné. So she says that there isn't, but it does seem also like a similar thing. It seems to be, so they have this kind of direct relationship to the process of making. So what's nice is they're almost like they're ready-mades from the studio or something. Does that make sense? Like he finds these like objects while making this very handmade thing. I mean, I know it's not because
because he has to make them.
Yeah. But I just like this kind of like back and forth between. He can't stop. Like these things just proliferate, and that is, that does feel right about sculpture.
Yeah, they're not only made to be touched, but they're produced by touching the sculpture itself, which is something really.
I mean, that's the other thing to say. Oh yeah, I didn't finish that thing about editions, right? So they're made as editions, and when I think of editions, like gallery editions, my experience of them is like galleries that are trying to fundraise somehow, get artists to produce small works of art that you can sell for not as much money. That's a kind of like one way of thinking about editions. And those 3 erotic objects, they are kind of quite small, but then he almost like turns it on his head and produces the ready-mades in these editions as well. And that kind of, it's an inversion of what the edition is. And then they get sold or given to museums and collections. So they kind of cement Duchamp's legacy around the world, right? That's why we have any Duchamps in the Tate. They're all reproductions.
And going back to, your like the thing they're talking about edition is like, or at least what Molesworth said in this and the Étant donnés essay, is that even those reproductions, they are made specifically to raise money for friends and family again. So
so his new wife has children to support, so he's like, okay, maybe this is a nice way of making some money for them. And then Man Ray needs some money, so he gives him the right to produce an edition. And I guess even the gallerists and stuff, it's like an agreement.
And I think there's something we'll talk more of this when we do a class around it, but like it's something really interesting about. So I grew up in Brazil and I went to art school in Brazil, and Brazil has like a very strong history of like printmaking and multiples that is not like it's based in a very different economy from here, and also like objects that can be touched. And then I when I heard you talking about the role editions have here, it made me think about how much this kind of like economic context also affected in Brazil. We do have a lot of sculptures that are made to be touched. That is like and those sort of formats that are about like distribution and circulation in Brazil exist because we had a horrible dictatorship, and you had to have like modes of circulation that are not passing through these like big institutional portals. And there's also like a politics of like make art that is cheap. So there's a lot of printmaking because the idea is like everybody should be able to buy. I mean, even like the big masters of Brazilian art that did printmaking, like if you save some money, you can buy a print and have it. And it doesn't have like, and people have practices that are just that. So they don't, it's not that they have a big practice and then they make like a screen print inspiring their work. Is like that those practices are constructed in those modes of distribution.
Yeah, I was talking to someone about this recently who's a painter who's got into printmaking, and he was saying that in America there are lots of artists who are kind of also master printmakers, but in Europe it's very much, I'm thinking I'm going to get this wrong now, but people going off to printmakers and making a print from their main practice, being like, oh, can we... Or I think he was saying that in America there's a history of painters who also learn printing and then use that as an additional way of working. Whereas over here it's often seen as like, oh, now I can make a print and I'll make like an edition of 20 and give it to my gallery and stuff. And I did remember that I used to work with a guy after the 2008 crash who in the boom years of the early 2000s, his job was just to train like new gallery artists on how to turn their work into prints for quick production, to like, you know, like make a load of cash really, really quickly, to like make a big edition of stuff. And we ended up working together in like as invigilating galleries because that business model had just disappeared entirely overnight. But that is obviously not what's happening here at all, because you don't have the art, you know, in the 50s the art market in that way doesn't exist. So he's making these things, as Molesworth says, he's not a cynical artist, and he doesn't need the money in the way that, and it wouldn't have been a quick route to money in the way that we might think of now. So he's making these things because he wants to make these things, and it does bring to light this, it is boyish and it is kind of clubby or whatever, but people going around each other's studios and handing people, or, you know, going to each other's houses and handing each other the art, which is really lovely. So is there a way of thinking about that if students are interested in making tactile work, like what do you say to people when they come to you with these ideas?
So it's interesting because I send them to like Latin American art,
right.
But then there's never a way to like bring it here because again, like that context here doesn't exist. Well, like
how would it work? What are you describing in Latin American art?
So I'm describing like I don't know, Lydia Clark animals that you can like move and play around and
how would they have been originally shown?
And like originally they were shown now they show reproductions because
sure. Oh, I see. Okay, yeah.
But whenever they show reproduction, it is like very rare that they're not meant to be used. So you have like, when I've seen it in real life, I've seen it in like big tables, and then you have like all these like sculptures, and then you go and you spend some time moving them around, and then you leave them whatever, and then people see it as the way that you left them.
And how are you instructed to do that? Or is it just obvious because other people are at the table moving them around?
Yeah, I think it's just obvious because other people are, but also because they're like there are other works. Like, so I don't know, I'm thinking about Pseudo Morales, who did like a screen printing Coca-Cola bottles and then put them back in circulation when the glass bottles were around. There are people that do stuff in bills. Like, there's been a tradition since the 60s of like works that circulate in that way. And I think one of the texts, reading the 10 text, is one of the Brazilian texts that kind of like cements that. But
as in, there's already a contextual understanding that some art
just circulates that way,
or handled, or given over to the audience in some way. Yeah, nice.
But I had never found a way to kind of like connect it here. So to me, that's the thing that this text is for me. I'm like, yes, now I can always point them back to this, and this idea that, again, that there's no, there's something really interesting to me in the idea that if you're interested in objects to be touched, then what does it mean to make like one object that is like super precious that you'll put in the plinth in your exhibition? That is almost like, if you're interested in making objects that have those sort of relations, then you need to rethink the circulation and distribution of the object as well. Maybe even the production. Like, it makes sense that it's a multiple, that it's not just one. Those things that I think, again, because Europe, maybe like the US as well, have like such development art economies and systems, that these are things that we never really talk about in art school, totally, like the circulation, distribution, because it's just like you put stuff, you do sculpture, you put it in galleries, or maybe you put it in a public space, but that's the limit of how much you need to concern yourself. While in places like Brazil or even more Peru, is like, if you go to art school, the chances of you having any sort of access to the art system, and not in a sense of like that thing in the 90s when people would go to art schools and say like, only 2 of you are going to be artists, because I feel like that's like a really stupid way of framing. But in a sense that we don't have a local art system that is that developed. You know, we're asked all the time as students, like, how is this going to be distributed? How is it going to circulate? How is it going to be shown? Because it's not going to be shown in a gallery. So how are people going to interact with it? And those are questions that I've never really seen asked here.
I think that's actually a pretty good proceed. So I gave my notes an alternative title, and I'm quite interested in. So this is called 10. You know, this series is going to be called 10 Texts on Sculpture, but my alternative title is something like "What is Sculpture About?" or like something to do with concepts of sculpture, because it's partly a take on like Peter Osborne's idea of post-conceptualism, where after conceptual art, lots of art kind of has to take the form of a concept that claims this could be art. Like this thing that I'm doing, which is slightly different to what art has previously been, could be art. And that's a kind of concept of art. And I think that's really nice. And I like it when people define what art does. So, for example, Helen Molesworth at one point here is talking about the irony of the ready-mades being lost or discarded and no longer being able to be exhibited and perform the role of art. And she says the irony here is pronounced in that one of the foremost roles of art is to make things visible. I think that's really nice because it's really simple. Art, the role of art is to make things visible. Anyway, but so I thought there was an alternative title to this work, which is a concept of art, which is something about sculpture is about making desire visible. Because I really did think that like as much as this essay was about handmadeness and this wrinkle in our historical understanding of Duchamp, it was also about making sense of Duchamp's erotic interests beyond the adolescent boyish humour. And I think it's really interesting. But you in your notes here, it says, well, maybe you can just tell me what you just didn't focus on that at all. That wasn't of kind of primary interest to you.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was really interesting because she's really interested in that, and Krauss, which also has an essay on is really interested in that, and part object comes from that. So it comes from like Rosalind Krauss writing on Louise Bourgeois and kind of Melanie Klein psychoanalytic theories, which are about like drives and the erotic and things like that. So yeah, I'm interested to hear your position. I'm just personally never very interested in psychoanalytical readings. Like I'm not, yeah.
That's such a lie, because you were like saying, so she uses Melanie Klein and is it G.W.
Winnicott?
Winnicott. Yeah. So yeah, Klein and Winnicott to describe two different ways of approaching the kind of later works by Duchamp. One is the part object, which is so lost objects, the notion of like the breast that stands in for the mother and that kind of stuff, that is then like taken away and is mourned or whatever. And then what's the Winnicott one? The Winnicott one is the other one.
The transitional object.
Transitional object.
And then she compares that to the ready-made. And the transitional object is like the blankie. So the kid uses to like, cuddle and calm themselves. And the idea is that the blankie is not representing the mother. The blankie is the thing in itself, and is a transition to like independence in a sense, or something like that. And
yeah, so that is the psychoanalytic reading, and I understand that if it ended there, I would say, okay, fair enough, you just aren't interested in that bit of the essay. But the whole culmination of the argument of the essay is linking this back exactly to why Duchamp might have been interested in handmade stuff, fragmentary forms and repetition, this notion of making multiple things. And it's all, her claim is that it's all about desire. That the final line, I think, is Duchamp's works propose that there is no adequate way to stage the problems of desire and repetition without recourse to a tactile relationship with the object world, and that it is precisely because our psychic lives become intricately bound up in things, whether commodities or art, the sculptures and its repetitions offer one of the most charged avenues into untying the knot of eroticism, repetition and commodities that governs our daily lives. So I feel like she's making quite a strong claim for like why she's doing that psychoanalysis.
Oh yeah, no, I think she's really into psychoanalysis. I'm not really into it.
No, but I just feel like all the stuff you're interested in, she's claiming the key to it is to link desire and repetition in, as it's viewed in psychoanalysis, to the kind of relationships we have to objects in the studio, in the street, in capitalism more generally. You just don't buy it.
I just don't buy it. I think my interest in
Yeah.
repetition goes through other things. My interest in repetition, it's much more connected to like maintenance and non-authorial work. It's like other forms of work, like domestic work, and like I'm a lot more interested than go to like feminist readings of like labor and stuff like that. But it's not. I'm interested to hear more because I do think like when I was reading your notes, I think there's a side of your work that is about desire and drive and the erotic that I've never maybe taken as seriously as I should. Like I'd never given the.
Well, that's why I wanted to talk about it, because I am interested in it, but in a way that it's actually quite hard to acknowledge. And I just thought it was so interesting that when I read the essay, I was like, hang on a minute. It's like Andrea's just refusing to acknowledge.
I'm refusing to acknowledge you.
Can't you see me? I think it's more just that I think that is partly what happens when desire is engaged with in a complex way in art, because it's quite a hard thing for obvious reasons. It's not something that people are that accomplished at speaking about. But I think what's really nice is that it's talking about the connection between whatever, like desire that is like, you know, in psychoanalysis is seen as kind of a fundamental drive or something, that also helps us understand why we keep going back to the studio. And like, you know, I think what was the thing I was looking at? So when she's writing about the commodities turned ready-mades in the studio that would then cease to be legible, so the objects were routinely thrown away, forgotten, or destroyed. And I made a note that, isn't this the way in the studios, right? So you have some materials, like not just you have some art and then you don't like the art anymore, but you have some materials that you bought. You're so excited about the material, you bring it into the studio, and then you either make the work and it works and that's great, or you make the work and it doesn't work or whatever. But then you keep coming across these materials over and over again, and you're kind of mourning the feeling that you had when you first bought or found or whatever the materials, and you keep trying to find ways of making it work, and then one day you realise that it's gone or something. And it's like, that is so close to these descriptions of the part or the transitional object. So it's not just artworks that can be read in that way. It's like fundamental bits of like studio practice.
But see, that's what's interesting, because our practice is so different, right? And I don't have a studio. And I also I'm not a sculptor. That's one of the things that I'm really interested about this. And I really, love about teaching is that it kind of forces me into like these different ways of practice and thinking. But I remember, I studied in Brazil. I did like 4 years of sculpture because I did 4 years of everything. Because I'm not a sculptor, but I'm a nerd. And I'm just like...
Wait, you did 4 years of everything? What do you mean?
It means that I took like extra a year and a half to graduate, and I did all the specializations. I did you have to do like 2 years of mandatory everything, and then 2 years extra. You choose 2 things. And I did all of them because it was free also. University is free in Brazil. So I did, sculpture, painting, printmaking, art history, film, photography.
Okay, all right. That's actually a really useful moment. So just like I think any, kind of Marxist would always say, like, it's really important to like know the material conditions of like whatever's happening to understand why it happened. I think there is also an element here where like by refusing the kind of psychoanalytic reading, I understand why, like you are like missing out on like maybe there is something really important about it, in particularly in sculptural practice, where you are making these like things that you do have this particular relationship to, which is more direct. I mean, I suppose image makers might be, at this point in capitalism, you might say that image makers have.
But I also don't make images.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe we'll find out what you make slowly through the podcast.
But I think you're right in the sense that there's a reason why I'm not a sculptor, right? Sure, there's a reason why I don't feel this attraction to I don't feel this attraction to like making things. And when I've made things, I've made furniture, like there's pieces of furniture in the house, and I made them as objects, and I refused to sell them as art, and I gave them away. Like I gave them away to the people that came to the exhibition, and I still bump into people that have these objects in their house because and it's obvious that that's the thing that I'm interested in the text, because that's the thing that I'm interested in, is this kind of like affection. I don't know. It has to do with affect, and it has to do with like sociality, and it has to do with structures and uses, that kind of like infrastructures that produce certain things in the world. That's what I'm interested in my practice. But I completely agree with you that there's something about, and it was funny because we're talking about this week, and you were like, how can you say you don't like psychoanalytical readings? You like Sedgwick, and you like Lisa Barazzier, and you like, I don't know, Judith Butler. You like all these people that refer to psychoanalytical readings. And with all these writers, when it gets to that point, it gets to the thing where like I just don't, they lose me. Like I don't get it. So I think the plan is we're gonna do at least one more text that is like has a it's kind of like focusing the erotic relation with materiality, and because it will be good. And it's really interesting that like when you get to Winnicott, for example, it makes perfect sense to me, and when it gets to Klein, I'm like, that's
so interesting.
It doesn't.
Yeah. We're probably finishing up soon, but I just really like this quote. among the most important things the ready-made ever did and does is to bestow this legibility upon the commodity. This legibility, which is a kind of form of visibility, I think it's leaning on from. This legibility upon the commodity, to its eccentricities and vagaries, to the deep peculiarity of objects, to the ways in which commodities trip us up or act as a trap or precede us. I think that's so lovely that like by mimicking, by mimicking one relationship with objects, by being a consumer and going out and buying things and buying what catches your eye, like almost operating as a pure consumer who doesn't actually require anything that they buy, you then make the peculiarity of these objects like more visible, which is a sculptural act, right? So again, that's like a slightly more complex reading than this like prankster figure of Duchamp buying a urinal because it's a bit rude and it sounds like it's doing a wee on you, and also because it gets him thrown out of the academy or whatever it is, and blah blah blah. But this is much more about art doing this job of making things visible, like art's job being mimetic, right? Like this being a concept of art, like he's reproduced or he's making something visible. He's making this like relationship we have to commodities, which is, if you're of a Marxist bent, like essentially contradictory. He somehow revisualizes it for the viewer of the artwork. It's really a lovely thing. But it does require that kind of psychoanalytic reading to like make that make sense, I think. But yeah, I can understand why you're not so interested in it. Oh, I found one more quote. I googled trebuchet, this the coat hanger that's on the floor, because she doesn't describe it. She describes this she mentions trebuchet or ready-made, but she doesn't describe it, so I googled it. And then I found this Duchamp quote. It was a real coat hanger that I wanted sometime to put on the wall and hang my things on, but I never did come to that. So it was on the floor and I would kick it every minute, every time I went out. I got crazy about it and I said, the hell with it. If it wants to stay there and bore me, I'll nail it down. And then the association with the ready-made came, and that was that. It was not bought to be a ready-made, it was a natural thing. It was nailed where it was, and then the idea came, which is brilliant, because that's another like studio moment of just like always tripping over stuff that you've bought it in there, but you haven't like sorted it out. Like you bought a load of wood to like make some shelves, but you never get around to making the shelves, and they take up the space which you're meant to save by like making the shelves. I really love that, for the failure of the studio.
I'm going to add a different quote, but this is not studio related.
Okay.
But I really love it. And she's talking about, again, like the kind of like the erotic encounter with Duchamp artworks, the large glass in this case. And she says, in other words, it was a way of talking about the effect of things on the body and the bodiliness of things. Yeah, I think maybe if this is the erotic, when, this is like when my relation with objects encounter this other erotic. This is the closest that I get to the erotic, basically. But this idea of like, objects doing things to your to the body, or like the body kind of like having to adapt to account for its relation to the thing, and at the same time things having bodies, a bit like Sarame phenomenology of things, when things are sticky for both sides. It's like the thing modifies you and you modify the thing, because the thing has a body as well. The thing is not like a dead inert objects. Like objects are never just in themselves, like they're kind of like, they're always, things to me are always in relation to other things, and I think
so that gets us right back round to maybe we can finish on this, which is the question of sculpture and affect, right? So students are I'm sure other people are interested in this, but these are the people that I talk to who are interested in making work that is tactile or participatory or somehow like gets the viewer's body involved. So the students that I talk to who want to have those things happen, often it's because they want to know that the viewer has been affected by their sculpture, and they can't trust that putting something in a room and having someone look at it will affect them. The fundamental thing I always say before we get into a question of how to facilitate interactivity or something is that it will, like looking at something it's qualitatively different to touching something, but it may well be as quantitatively affecting as touching something. Like it's like, what's the word? Relational aesthetics or something. Something being social doesn't necessarily mean that it is more political. Something involving people talking or something doesn't mean that it's more political than.
But it's not even like political, it's more like embodied, right? Because
embodied, that's
what Molesworth is saying is like that I don't know, like the urinal does that, right? The urinal is like affecting you and playing and doing things to your body, and sort of like your body is also somehow doing things to the body of the urinal. Like that, these two things are constituting themselves. And I don't think that's every sculpture, but I think there's a specific quality for certain sculptures that kind of like demand that sort of like embodied relation. And I think Duchamp's work, especially after reading this, I think I buy that's something that his sculptures are concerned in doing, establishing that embodied relationship.
Yeah, and the commodity is really, the certain of the ready-mades where they're repositioned, they do that straight away, because you know the coat rack should be on the wall, you know the urinal should be the other way up, you know the spade, whatever, shouldn't be hanging, you know the bags of coal shouldn't be hanging from the ceiling, blah blah blah. Like it kind of engages with like our normal relationship. What, you know, the Heidegger thing would be like the hammer that you use to bang in the nail. You know, it engages with that relationship of use and then kind of perverts it or kind of subverts it in some way. And that, exactly, that is affecting to like suddenly be confronted with the urinal that you can't use, or that would, if it was plumbed in, be firing water out at you or whatever, or overflowing or something, you know. But yeah, I suppose that just brings us back to this question of like why you want something to be tactile. And I think that is key, is that Molesworth connects things that are tactile in Duchamp's practice with things that aren't tactile, but the claim is that they're still doing something really, you know, about the body and with the body of the viewer each time. Yeah, that's nice.
Before we finish, can we talk just a little bit about, I'm quite interested, we didn't went into it, but like I'm interested in the handmade quality of things as well. It's like, what does that do, you know, to see an object? I have to confess that I went to the Tate Modern like a few weeks before I read this text, and I saw the urinal and I did not realize, you know, I didn't even think it was a reproduction because I didn't even look at it. I was like, oh, that's the urinal.
You walked past it. Yeah,
I looked at it, but I just like register it. I didn't pay attention. But I was thinking about, you know, this kind of post-COVID world where there is, as far as I understand, like an international trend, because I hear other artists in other countries saying, you know, that lots of our students are interested in like ceramics and things that require like being made by hand, but also like objects that then hold that memory of being made by hand as a quality of sculpture. And I was wondering, if there's something in this text, and maybe it is through the psychoanalytical reading or not, but there's something in this text that can help us kind of like place this sort of like, quality of sculpture that I think was a lot less talk like 5 years ago. You know, when you were talking about big things, like I'm talking about assemblages, or you're talking about these other qualities of the thing, but the handmade seems to be in a way that is not connected to craft as it was again like 5 or 6 years ago.
Because it was, there was talk about, you know, people loved wonky ceramics, didn't they, when 10 years ago or something, and that's continued. But I think it has shifted somewhat, because it did seem to be, I don't know if it's connected a little bit to feeling like you're in control or something, or you have power over a certain space, especially with students who were, I mean, my COVID cohort, as it were, have just finished. So I don't know if that's something to do with having to, you know, spending a year working at home in a very limited space, if you had to work on your kitchen table or something like that, or in your bedroom or whatever it was. So it'd be interesting to see if that kind of continues. But I do wonder whether the feeling of being able to make something in your bedroom out of materials that you have close by, or like you bring a bag of clay home and you can make that, and you know that it's secure and you're not gonna, like, I don't know, you don't have to put it back together for a crit, or like remember how to turn it on or off or something. I don't know. there's something more direct, like authenticity used to be like a way of explaining it or something, like in a world of images that are constantly changing, or digital files that are like you have 200 versions of the same file and you can't find the right one to show to your tutor or whatever. Like having this little handmade object that you can carry back and forth between your house and the studio and the exhibition space or whatever, and knowing that you won't lose it, or like it won't be corrupted by something. I don't know. But
I think that's interesting, because then you're placing that in the relation between the artist and making the thing. And I think I'm interested in the relation of what the object does to the viewer, like, because I think that's the way that intuitively, especially if you teach, that's the first place that you go into the relation between the student and the thing that they're making. But I wonder if there's something about the relation between the sculpture and what it's doing in the world. I
don't know. Like, what do you think? Do you do you think that it depends how they're shown, right? If they're just shown in normal gallery presentations, then they don't hold on to that quality of like safety, and they just appear as another gallery object. So do you think there is a particular relationship between the handmade things and viewers within fine art practice, rather than, you know, fine art students making these things and showing them?
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking about like other, for example, like the other Molesworth text that I've been reading, which is the housework artwork text, and she's talking about, it's kind of like she's doing something similar to what she's doing here with conceptual art, and she's talking about Mary Kelly and Judy Chicago and Martha Rosler and Muriel Laderman-Ukeles. And when she's talking about Judy Chicago and Mary Kelly, there's something really interesting because they're doing conceptual art, but they're doing it in this, again, like it's like this handmade way. Like, so Chicago is making the ceramics and Mary Kelly is making all her, you know, print of her baby's diapers and stuff like that. And there's something about how it's exactly the handmade quality that kind of expels them from conceptual art, that is seen as like related to womanhood and minor, and handmade is this thing that is not cerebral. So it does something profound to the object's relation to the viewer. You know, I feel like historically, but about like 5 or 6 years ago, when you had like students that were doing all these things that were handmade, a lot of times the way they were treated, they were usually female students or like female identified students, that they were like be dismissed as feminist art. So like feminist art or crafts, where you threw, you know, the bag where you threw this kind of like, handmade aesthetics. And now with this, after reading this text and I'm thinking about, the handmade again during COVID, I'm just like, and this kind of like proposed genealogy. And I think that's what's interesting about this text as well, is if you come up with this like different genealogy from Western sculpture, when the handmade never left, you know, and actually conceptual art and minimalism were the minor things, and the major things were these other forms of art, like, you know, like Louis Bourgeois and Kusama and Gober and all these things. Then what? I'm just interested what new context they create for the handmade relation now.
Yes, but I agree, and I think that's super interesting, and that is what, you know, that's why this podcast series is going to be really nice, because it is going to offer all these like alternative genealogies for like students making art now, or even, you know, not just students, anyone making art now. But one thing I would say about that house, what's the essay called? Housework?
I think it's artwork. Something like that.
It's that part of the reason that those artists have to be kept out or something of the genre of conceptual art is because they would infect the fact that they are upfront about the handmade quality of their art, would infect other readings of, you know, like whatever, more male, whatever, for a better word, like more male ideas of conceptual art that claim that they're not engaging it. But because of course art has to be made, like it has to be, because it is art, and it's not, you might use industrial materials, but you're not going to get a factory to like, you still have to make it, and it's still made out of something. And lots of conceptual artists didn't want to engage with that, was that the way that their concepts got into the world was through materials, and like that was the art bit. The art bit was not actually the idea, it was the way it got into the space that it was being shown. So I think that's interesting anyway, in the sense that like once you read that, there's no going back once you read that article or once you know that history, because you can no longer view conceptual art as like an art that's about ideas, because it's not. It's about what happens when someone tries to turn an idea into, or someone tries to make the idea as important to the viewer as the physical rendering of the idea. Even then I'm slipping into that language of like idea and rendering of the idea, but like ultimately, like, you know, going back to that Peter Osborne essay, Post-Conceptualism, that's why hard conceptualism kind of fails, is because if you really try and make it just like the idea is more important than the art, then the ideas have to be really, really simple and like philosophically very uninteresting. So that's what's interesting, is that he kind of reads the end of pure conceptual art as like a series of artworks that just aren't that, the philosophy of it or the ideas part of it is really boring, because they have to be super simple to like refuse the materiality of the work or something. I don't know what that does for handmade stuff.
I don't know either, but hopefully during the other readings.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thanks so much. So like I said, if you want to read the text, then go to decursaint.com/Bad Vibes Club. and that's DEKERSAINT.com/Bad Vibes Club. And you can read this Helen Molesworth text. Next time we'll be speaking about a text by Hal Foster on the work of Robert Gober. Thanks so much for listening.